There is a transformation unfolding across the canned goods aisle of every major grocery retailer in this country. It is not sudden, it is not making headlines, but it is real, it is accelerating, and the vast majority of consumers remain entirely unaware of it. 15 canned products are becoming harder to locate, more costly to purchase, or in some cases, permanently unavailable. The forces behind this shift are varied: climate disruption, geopolitical trade policy, labor economics, corporate restructuring. But the cumulative effect is singular. The canned goods section you have relied upon for years is contracting, and it is not coming back to what it was. Most of these disappearances have rational, traceable causes: drought, tariff escalation, maritime freight volatility, agricultural labor collapse. But the final item on this countdown, the one occupying the #1 position, operates on an entirely different logic. That product is not scarce. The raw materials are not constrained. The manufacturer has made a deliberate, strategic decision to cease production, and they have done so without any meaningful public disclosure. This breakdown covers all 15, the specific dynamics driving each one, and the concrete steps available to you before these shifts reach your shopping cart in ways you cannot easily reverse. Number 15. Canned pineapple. This is a logical place to begin because canned pineapple illustrates, in its simplest form, the structural vulnerability that repeats across nearly every entry on this list. Pineapple destined for canning in the United States has virtually zero domestic production. The entirety of what sits on American shelves traveled thousands of miles from growing regions concentrated in Southeast Asia, Thailand, the Philippines, Indonesia, or from Central American producers. Every single can absorb transoceanic container freight rates and pass through a tariff structure before it reached the distribution warehouse, let alone the retail shelf. Over the past 3 years, both of those cost inputs, international shipping and import duties, have risen substantially and have not retreated to pre-disruption baselines. Container freight rates from Asian ports, while below their pandemic peak, remain structurally elevated compared to 2019 levels. Tariff policy on imported agricultural goods has tightened rather than relaxed. Layer onto this the reality that multiple pineapple-growing regions have experienced climate-driven harvest disruptions. Irregular monsoon patterns across Southeast Asia have compressed yields, meaning fewer tons of fruit are entering the processing pipeline in a given season. Less raw product feeding into the canning infrastructure, arriving into a logistics chain that charges more per unit to move it, produces a predictable outcome at the retail endpoint. Trade analysts monitoring canned fruit import flows have consistently identified pineapple as one of the most exposed subcategories. The absence of any domestic fallback supply, even a marginal one, means there is no buffer. Every disruption at the origin translates directly, and in full, to the American shelf. For consumers who use canned pineapple with any regularity, in baking, in rice dishes, in glazes, the rational response is accumulation, when pricing is reasonable. The product carries a shelf life measured in years. There is no spoilage risk in maintaining a modest reserve. And the pricing trajectory offers no indication of reversal. Number 14. Canned coconut milk. A decade ago, coconut milk occupied a niche position in the American grocery landscape. It was found primarily in stores serving Southeast Asian communities or tucked into a small international foods section. That is no longer the case. The explosion of plant-based cooking, the mainstreaming of Thai and Indian curries in home kitchens, and the widespread adoption of coconut milk in smoothies and baked goods have transformed it into a genuinely high-demand staple. The production geography, however, has not evolved alongside that demand. Virtually all canned coconut milk consumed in the United States originates from 3 countries: Thailand, the Philippines, and Indonesia, where domestic production does not exist in any meaningful capacity. This creates the same structural exposure as pineapple, complete dependency on foreign production and international freight, but amplified by the pace at which demand has grown. Import pricing data on canned coconut milk has shown cost escalation outpacing nearly every comparable canned product category over the past 18 months. The coconut itself has not become dramatically more expensive at the farm level. The processing has not fundamentally changed. What has changed is the cost architecture of moving a heavy, liquid-filled steel container from a Southeast Asian port to an American warehouse. Those logistics costs, combined with tariff layers, flow through unmitigated to the consumer. Distribution contacts serving Asian grocery channels have reported increasingly erratic shipment schedules, containers arriving weeks behind expected timelines, partial fulfillment against placed orders, The consistency that retailers depend on to maintain stocked shelves has degraded measurably. For households where coconut milk is a weekly ingredient rather than an occasional purchase, the arithmetic favors stocking ahead. Purchase when available and when priced within an acceptable range. The product does not degrade meaningfully over its rated shelf life, and the supply chain friction driving these issues is not resolving in the near term. If this information is proving valuable, take a moment to hit the like button, leave a comment about what you are seeing at your local stores, and subscribe to this channel so you do not miss the rest of this breakdown. Let us continue. Number 13. Canned olives. The olive oil price crisis of the past 2 years has received substantial media coverage. What has received almost no attention is the direct and unavoidable connection between olive oil scarcity and the availability and pricing of canned and jarred olives. These are not separate products sourced from separate supply chains. They originate from the same trees, harvested from the same orchards, subject to the same climatic conditions. When prolonged drought across the Mediterranean basin, particularly in Spain, which produces the majority of the world's olives, alongside Italy and Greece, devastates harvest volumes, both the oil and the whole fruit products contract simultaneously. What makes this situation particularly resistant to near-term correction is the biology of olive trees under sustained drought stress. These are not annual crops that reset each planting season. Olive trees that have endured consecutive years of insufficient moisture suffer root system degradation. Even with a return to normal rainfall, recovery and productive capacity takes multiple growing seasons. Agricultural monitoring bodies focused on Mediterranean perennial crops have classified current olive production shortfalls as a multi-year structural deficit, not a temporary weather-related dip. For American consumers, nearly all canned olive supply flows from these same stressed Mediterranean origins. Domestic olive production in California exists, but services a small fraction of total demand and faces its own water constraint challenges. There is no readily available alternative supply basin capable of compensating for Mediterranean shortfalls at scale. The consumer who assumes olive prices will normalize within a season or two is operating on a misunderstanding of the underlying agricultural timeline. Stocking at current prices, while they may feel elevated, is likely to appear rational in retrospect as the supply deficit continues to work through the system. Number 12. Canned mandarin oranges. This is an entry that receives almost no discussion, yet the dynamics underlying it are significant. Canned mandarin oranges, the small, peeled citrus segments found in fruit cups, salads, and children's lunches across millions of households, come overwhelmingly from China. China dominates global production of this specific product format to a degree that few consumers appreciate. The trade relationship between the United States and China has introduced successive rounds of tariff escalation that have directly increased landed costs on this product. Beyond tariffs, quality inspection protocols and import clearance timelines have lengthened, adding logistical friction that translates into higher per-unit distribution costs. Simultaneously, domestic citrus production in the United States has faced its own set of pressures. Citrus greening disease has devastated Florida's orchards. California citrus faces water allocation constraints. Neither region produces mandarin oranges for canning at any scale that could substitute for Chinese imports. The result is a product category quietly becoming more expensive and less consistently available, with no alternative sourcing pathway to relieve the pressure. Consumers who rely on canned mandarins for meal preparation or children's nutrition should be aware that this is a structurally vulnerable category with no near-term resolution in sight. Number 11. Canned pumpkin. The fragility of canned pumpkin supply is one of the most underappreciated risks in the entire grocery aisle. Consumers understand, in a general sense, that pumpkin is seasonal. What they do not grasp is how extraordinarily narrow the production window actually is, and how completely a single disruption within that window can eliminate an entire season's output. Processing pumpkins, the Dickinson variety that constitutes nearly all commercially canned pumpkin, require a precise combination of temperature and soil moisture across a compressed growing period. The harvest itself must occur within a tight time frame. If adverse conditions strike during that window, an unexpected heat dome, excessive rainfall at the wrong developmental stage, the crop does not simply diminish. It can fail entirely for that cycle. There is no mechanism for recovery. The processing infrastructure cannot simply wait. The agricultural calendar does not offer a makeup period. This is why canned pumpkin experiences the kind of sharp, binary availability swings that other canned vegetables do not. Agricultural analysts have repeatedly identified it as among the most timing-sensitive vegetable crops in commercial production. A single poorly timed weather event, can cascade into months of retail shortage. The strategic response is elegantly simple. Purchase canned pumpkin during the summer months, well in advance of the autumn demand surge. July and August represent the optimal acquisition window. Inventory from the prior season is typically still available, demand is minimal, and pricing reflects neither scarcity nor seasonal urgency. The product maintains quality for years in storage. Buying 2 months early costs nothing and eliminates the most common failure mode entirely. Number 10. Canned corn and green beans. If you were asked to identify the canned vegetable category least likely to face supply disruption, domestically grown corn and green beans would be a reasonable answer. These are high-volume, widely cultivated staple crops processed across multiple regions of the United States. The infrastructure is mature, the demand patterns are predictable, and yet these categories are experiencing genuine supply inconsistency. The driver is not weather, and it is not pricing. It is labor. The harvest of vegetables destined for canning operations requires human workers during an extremely time-sensitive window. When the crop reaches processing maturity, it must be brought in rapidly. Delays of even several days can render product unsuitable for the canning line. Agricultural labor availability in key growing regions has deteriorated markedly over the past 2 years, driven by demographic shifts, immigration policy changes, and competition from other sectors offering less physically demanding work at comparable or superior wages. When harvest labor falls short, fields are not fully picked. Processing plants receive less raw input. Reduced input translates directly into reduced canned output, which manifests on retail shelves months later as inconsistent stock levels and involuntary brand substitutions. Regional agricultural bureaus have flagged labor scarcity as among the most structurally persistent pressures facing vegetable supply chains. Unlike weather, which varies season to season, labor dynamics shift slowly and are influenced by policy and demographic forces that do not self-correct. Retail purchasing managers have reported an increasing frequency of distributor substitutions, orders placed for one brand arriving filled with whatever alternative product happened to be in the warehouse. The familiar brand a consumer has purchased for years may simply not be available, replaced without notice by an unfamiliar alternative. Canned corn and green beans are inexpensive and virtually imperishable. Maintaining a modest surplus when pricing is favorable is among the lowest risk, highest return pantry decisions available. Take a second to like this video if you are finding it useful. Drop a comment with the canned item you have had the hardest time finding recently, and subscribe if you have not already. There is more ahead, and some of the remaining entries are going to shift how you think about your next grocery trip. Number 9. Large format and family-size cans. This entry addresses not a specific food product, but a packaging strategy that has been quietly redistributing cost from manufacturers to consumers without triggering the awareness mechanisms that typically alert shoppers to price increases. The mechanism is straightforward. When input costs rise, metal pricing, raw ingredients, energy, manufacturers face a choice between 2 responses. They can increase the retail price, which consumers notice immediately and which often triggers reduced purchasing volume. Or they can reduce the package size while holding the shelf price roughly constant, a strategy that preserves the visual impression of price stability while fundamentally altering the value proposition. The latter approach has been deployed extensively across the canned goods category in the current cost environment. Large format and family-size cans, the packaging options that historically delivered the best per-ounce economics, have been removed from product lineups across multiple categories. In their place, smaller individual serving formats occupy the same shelf footage, priced at levels that appear comparable but deliver significantly less product per dollar. Consumer price researchers tracking unit economics across grocery categories have documented this pattern with increasing frequency throughout 2025 and 2026. The displayed shelf price may remain within a familiar range, but the price per ounce, the true measure of what a consumer is paying for the food itself, has risen substantially through format reduction rather than sticker adjustment. The countermeasure is simple and takes seconds. Read the unit price on the shelf tag, not the sticker price on the can. Most retailers are required to display price per ounce information. When larger formats remain available, they almost invariably represent superior value. Purchase them while they exist in the product lineup, because the trend line points toward further format reduction, not reversal. Number 8. Canned corned beef. Canned corned beef occupies a relatively small segment of the overall canned protein market, but its current situation illuminates a supply chain dynamic that most consumers have never had reason to consider. A substantial share of canned corned beef sold in the United States is imported from South American cattle-producing nations, with Brazil being the dominant source. Global beef economics have been under sustained pressure for several years, driven primarily by herd reductions across major ranching regions. Extended drought conditions in South America and parts of Australia forced ranchers to reduce their breeding stock, a decision with consequences that extend far beyond the immediate season. The biological reality of cattle reproduction means that herd rebuilding is an inherently slow process. A decision to cull breeding animals today removes productive capacity for years into the future. The supply contraction ripples downstream through every beef-derived product category, including processed and canned formats that consumers rarely connect to the broader cattle supply narrative. Import and distribution professionals within the food logistics sector have described canned corned beef pricing adjustments this year as notably incremental, small enough per unit to avoid triggering consumer awareness, but cumulatively significant across a household's annual purchasing volume. For consumers who include this product in their regular rotation, purchasing at currently available pricing represents a hedge against further escalation. The structural conditions driving elevated beef costs, herd recovery timelines, ongoing climate stress on ranching regions are measured in years, not months. Number 7. Canned beans. Black, kidney, chickpea, pinto. Canned beans represent one of the most widely purchased protein sources in the American grocery system. They are foundational to an enormous range of dietary patterns. Budget-conscious families, plant-based households, emergency preparedness planners, institutional food programs. Their affordability and versatility have made them a baseline staple for generations. That affordability is now under direct structural threat, and the source of the pressure is not the bean itself. It is the container. Tariffs imposed on imported aluminum and tin plate, the raw materials from which cans are manufactured, have meaningfully increased the per-unit cost of producing a standard food can. This cost increase affects the entire canned goods industry, but its impact is disproportionately concentrated on products that have historically operated at the thinnest retail margins. Canned beans are among the thinnest margin items in the aisle. When a product has been priced for decades on razor-thin economics, there is no internal cushion to absorb a rise in packaging costs. The increase passes through to the shelf price with minimal attenuation. Commodity market analysts tracking the relationship between metal tariffs and retail canned goods pricing have identified beans as one of the most directly exposed categories, a product where packaging cost now represents a larger proportional share of the total retail price than at any point in recent history. One consumer who tracked her weekly bean purchases over a 5-month period documented a per-can price increase of approximately 28 to 30% on her regular black bean purchase. The product inside was identical. The only variable was the cost of the metal surrounding it. Dried beans remain a viable and economically superior alternative. The raw commodity has not experienced comparable price escalation, and the prepared result is functionally equivalent. But for the substantial number of households that depend on the convenience of canned preparation, bulk purchasing during promotional pricing events represents the most effective available response. Canned beans maintain quality for years in storage and will unquestionably be consumed. Quick reminder, if you are finding this analysis worthwhile, a like genuinely helps this content reach other people who need to see it. Leave a comment, sharing which of these items has surprised you most, and subscribe so you are notified when the next analysis drops. Now, back to the list. Number 6. Canned sardines. Sardines have historically occupied a modest but consistent position in the canned protein landscape. A smaller consumer base, but one characterized by strong loyalty and repeat purchasing behavior. The value proposition was compelling: substantial protein content, high omega-3 fatty acid concentration, at a price point that made it accessible to virtually any budget level. That equilibrium is breaking down, driven by a collision between contracting supply and expanding demand. On the supply side, sardine populations in key harvesting regions have experienced measurable stress. Pacific sardine stocks and North African fisheries, Morocco in particular, which ranks among the world's largest sardine exporters, have seen reduced catch volumes across multiple recent seasons. Warmer ocean temperature cycles have altered migration patterns, shifting fish away from traditional harvesting zones and reducing the reliability of established fishing operations. On the demand side, growing consumer awareness of omega-3 fatty acids and affordable animal protein has steadily broadened the sardine consumer base. Health-conscious shoppers who previously never considered sardines are now purchasing them regularly, adding incremental demand to a supply pool that is simultaneously contracting. Seafood trade publications covering global sardine landings in 2025 and 2026 have documented the tightening supply from North African sources, feeding directly into reduced import volumes, reaching American distribution networks. The practical manifestation at retail is reduced brand variety, inconsistent availability, and upward price movement. Food distribution professionals have confirmed increasing frequency of partial order fulfillment and brand substitution on sardine products. Suppliers unable to guarantee consistent volume to their retail customers. Sardines carry extended shelf stability. If this product is part of your regular purchasing pattern, the window to acquire preferred brands and varieties is measurably narrower than it was 12 months ago. Waiting until your preferred option disappears means selecting from whatever remains. Number 5. Canned salmon. This is an entry that connects directly to the sardine story, but operates at a larger scale with different underlying mechanics. Canned salmon, particularly pink and sockeye varieties from Pacific fisheries, has long served as an affordable source of high-quality protein and essential fatty acids. It occupies a critical role in the diets of budget-conscious households and is a staple in school lunch programs and institutional feeding operations. Pacific salmon runs have experienced significant volatility in recent years. Warming river temperatures have disrupted spawning cycles. Ocean conditions have altered the marine food web that juvenile salmon depend upon during their oceanic growth phase. Multiple Pacific coast fisheries have implemented catch restrictions or outright closures in response to population assessments showing stocks below sustainable harvest thresholds. The regulatory tightening is scientifically justified. These are conservation measures designed to prevent population collapse. But the downstream consequence for canned product supply is immediate and direct. Less fish harvested means less fish processed into cans, and there is no alternative production pathway available to compensate for the shortfall. Imported canned salmon, primarily from Alaska but also from Canadian and Russian fisheries, faces its own set of constraints: geopolitical trade friction, elevated freight costs, and currency dynamics that affect import economics. The net result across both domestic and imported supply channels is a product category facing sustained availability pressure with no clear resolution timeline. Consumers who rely on canned salmon should be actively monitoring pricing and availability. When the product is present at reasonable prices, purchasing beyond immediate needs is a sound strategy. The biological and regulatory factors constraining supply operate on timescales that offer no prospect of rapid normalization. Number 4. Canned tomatoes. Canned tomatoes function as foundational infrastructure for an enormous share of home cooking. Pasta sauces, chili, soups, stews, braises, casseroles, the range of preparations built upon canned tomato products is vast. They operate almost invisibly in the kitchen, a constant presence that most cooks take entirely for granted. Until the price shifts far enough or the availability changes sharply enough to force conscious attention. Both are happening now. The domestic pressure originates in California, which produces the dominant share of processing tomatoes destined for American cans. California's agricultural sector has endured a brutal sequence of climate events, extended drought years that depleted soil moisture and stressed root systems, followed by atmospheric river storm events delivering excessive precipitation at precisely the worst moments in the growing calendar. Rain arriving just before harvest, when fruit is at maximum vulnerability, can destroy a significant portion of a season's yield in a matter of days. Agricultural reporting from California's Central Valley has documented reduced processing tomato acreage this season relative to prior years. Less planted area, combined with the ongoing climatic volatility affecting yields on existing acreage, translates into less canned product flowing through the distribution system. This is not a projection. It is currently reflected in distributor allocations. The imported side of the equation faces a separate but compounding pressure. Italian tomato products, San Marzano whole-peeled tomatoes, crushed tomato, passata, carry tariff burdens that have increased their landed cost in the American market. For consumers who purchase from that segment of the shelf, the premium over domestic alternatives has widened. Food service and restaurant industry buyers have already received explicit guidance from their distributors to anticipate continued upward pricing pressure on tomato products through the balance of this year. Wholesale market signals of this nature typically manifest at retail with a lag of several months. The direction is established. The magnitude is the only remaining variable. For households where canned tomatoes are a consistent cooking input, bulk purchasing during sales, particularly of store-brand products, which draw from the same regional crop base at lower price points, represents the most practical available response. If this content is resonating with you, I would genuinely appreciate a like, a comment sharing what you are experiencing at your own stores, and a subscription so you stay informed as this situation continues to develop. The final entries carry the most significant implications, and the number one spot is something I believe every consumer needs to understand. Number 3. Store brand and private label canned vegetables. This entry is distinct from the earlier discussion of canned corn and green beans. That segment addressed the underlying supply constraints. This one addresses who absorbs the consequences of those constraints most severely, and through what mechanism. Store brand and private label canned goods are not a secondary option for a large segment of American households. They are the primary option. In many cases, they are the only option that fits within a functional grocery budget. These products frequently match or exceed the quality of their name brand equivalents. Many are processed in identical facilities, from the same raw inputs, differentiated only by the label on the outside of the can. The lower retail price that makes private label products essential for budget-constrained households is achieved through thinner operating margins. This is the fundamental trade-off: lower price, less profit per unit. Under normal conditions, this model functions effectively because volume compensates for margin compression. Under conditions of rising input costs, more expensive metal for cans, higher agricultural commodity prices, elevated logistics costs, thin margins become fragile margins. Retailers face a choice: absorb the cost increase and erode profitability, raise private label prices, and undermine the value proposition that defines the product category, or reduce the assortment. Industry analysis of canned goods retail strategy in 2025 and 2026 has documented a clear pattern: assortment contraction. Rather than implementing broad price increases across the private label lineup, retailers have narrowed the selection. Slower-moving store brand varieties are discontinued. That shelf space is reallocated, sometimes to faster-turning private label items, sometimes to name brand products that generate higher margin per linear foot of shelf. The consumer experience of this shift is subtle but consequential. A variety purchased consistently for months or years simply stops appearing. No signage explains its departure. No alternative is suggested. The shelf looks slightly different, slightly more consolidated, and slightly less responsive to the specific needs of the budget-conscious shopper. If store-brand canned vegetables constitute a meaningful component of your household grocery strategy, active attention is warranted. Monitor availability of your regular varieties. When case pricing is offered on promotional terms, take advantage. Do not assume continuity of assortment. The structural incentives facing retailers in the current cost environment point toward further rationalization, not restoration. Number 2. Canned tuna. Canned tuna is arguably the single most widely purchased canned protein in the American market. Its reach spans demographic categories, dietary philosophies, and income levels. It is among the first canned products most adults learn to prepare, and for many households, it has been a constant presence for decades. It is currently subject to simultaneous pressure from two independent and compounding forces, and the convergence of these forces is producing outcomes that exceed what either would generate in isolation. The first force is biological and regulatory. Warming ocean temperatures have displaced skipjack and yellowfin tuna populations, the primary species used in commercial canning, away from the traditional fishing zones where industrial-scale harvest has historically concentrated. International fisheries management bodies have responded by tightening catch quotas, a scientifically necessary response to prevent over-harvesting of stressed populations. The conservation logic is sound. The supply consequence is direct. Less fish caught means less fish canned. The second force is material. The same tariff structure on imported aluminum and tin plate that is affecting canned beans is simultaneously affecting canned tuna, but at a different scale. Tuna is one of the highest volume canned product categories. A modest per-unit increase in can manufacturing cost, when multiplied across the enormous volume of tuna cans produced and sold, aggregates into a significant total cost burden that must be absorbed somewhere in the value chain. Trade publications covering both seafood supply logistics and packaging cost economics have flagged tuna as occupying a uniquely pressured position, caught between declining catch availability and rising container costs. Retailers have exhausted the margin they can absorb. What remains flows to the shelf. The observable retail manifestation includes persistent price escalation, reduced promotional frequency, and a pattern of partial shipment fulfillment that has shifted from anomaly to norm. Stores are receiving less than they order, and the gap between ordered and delivered quantities is not narrowing. For consumers who include canned tuna in their regular meal planning, maintaining a small rotating reserve, Purchasing a few additional cans during sales and consuming oldest inventory first is a practical and low-cost hedge against continued supply degradation and price escalation. The increases in this category have been gradual enough to avoid triggering immediate alarm, which is precisely why their cumulative impact tends to surprise consumers when they finally calculate the aggregate change. Number 1. Canned soup. Every preceding entry on this list has been driven by external constraints. Ecological disruption, shifting fish populations, consecutive drought seasons, devastating perennial crops, tariff policy, increasing the cost of packaging materials, labor market dynamics, reducing agricultural harvest capacity, freight cost structures that failed to normalize after pandemic-era disruption. These are forces acting upon manufacturers and retailers, constraints imposed by circumstances beyond their direct control. The number 1 entry is fundamentally different. It is not a constraint. It is a corporate strategic decision, executed deliberately and without meaningful public transparency. Major soup manufacturers have been systematically discontinuing slower-selling varieties and reformulating others throughout 2025 and into 2026. The official framing positions these changes as responses to evolving consumer preferences, demand for reduced sodium, cleaner ingredient labels, modernized flavor profiles. Presented this way, the narrative sounds reasonable, progressive, customer responsive. The reality at shelf level tells a different story. Soup varieties that have maintained consistent purchase loyalty for years, in many cases for decades, have been removed from production entirely, not temporarily suspended due to supply constraints, not delayed by logistics disruptions,